Some children learn early that the world doesn't owe them kindness. Silas Brennan was one of those children. At 11 years old, he already knew hunger like an old friend, knew the sting of a hand across his face, knew what it meant to be invisible. But what he didn't know yet was that in 7 days, 400 Apache warriors would surround his settlement asking for him by name. And what they would do when they found him would change everything. Anyone thought they understood about mercy, honor, and the debts that bind one's soul to another. The sun hung low between the pines as Silas knelt by the creek, filling the dented metal canteen that Abner Cole had given him that morning. His hand shook slightly, not from cold. The day still held its warmth, but from the certainty that he'd already taken too long. Abner didn't tolerate delays, didn't tolerate much of anything really, except work done fast and silent. The water ran clear over the smooth stones, and Silas watched it for just a moment longer than he should have. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the forest. Not the crack of a branch under a deer's hoof, not the rustle of wind through needles. Something else, something that made his chest tighten. He stood slowly, the canteen forgotten in his hand, water still pouring from its open mouth. The sound came again, a low rasp, like breath dragged over broken glass. It came from deeper in the trees, past the wild berry bushes that marked where settlement land gave way to wilderness. Every person in the settlement had heard the stories. Apache raids, scalped families, burnt cabins. His own aunt, Hattie, crossed herself whenever anyone mentioned the native tribes, as if the mere word could summon violence. Silas should have run, should have grabbed the canteen and raced back to Abner's stable without looking back. But the sound came a third time, weaker now, and something in it stopped him cold. It wasn't the sound of threat. It was the sound of something dying. Silas moved through the trees like a shadow, his worn boots barely disturbing the carpet. Of pine needles. 50 paces in, he saw him. The warrior lay on his back, one arm thrown across his chest, the other stretched towards something Silas couldn't see. Blood had soaked through the bucking shirt, dark and spreading. Deep claw marks ran across the man's shoulder and neck. 4 parallel gouges that could only have come from one thing. Mountain lion, maybe a bear. The warrior's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. Intricate beadwork decorated his clothing, and feathers were woven into his long black hair, even broken and bleeding. There was something powerful about him, something that made Silas feel small in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He should have left, should have pretended he'd never seen anything. But the man's lips moved, forming words Silas couldn't understand, and his hand twitched as if reaching for help that would never come. Silas stepped closer, then closer. Still, the warrior's eyes opened, dark and alert despite the pain, and fixed on the boy's face. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the man spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper, the words rolling in a language that sounded like the wind through canyon walls. "I don't understand," Silas said quietly. His own voice surprised him, small and hollow in the vast silence of the forest. The warrior's hand lifted slightly, trembling with effort, and gestured weakly toward his mouth. Then to Silas, then to the canteen still clutched in the boy's hand. Water. He wanted water. Silas glanced back toward the settlement. If anyone found out he'd been near an Apache, let alone helped one, Abner would throw him out for sure. Maybe worse. But when he looked back at the dying man, he saw something he recognized in those dark eyes. The same thing he saw in his own reflection when he passed the water trough at the stable. Loneliness, the kind that knows it will die alone. He knelt beside the warrior and lifted the canteen to his lips. The man drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down his chin and mixing with the blood on his chest. When he finished, his hand shot out and gripped Silas's wrist with surprising strength. He spoke again, urgent now, his eyes burning with something that looked like gratitude and warning tangled together. Then his grip loosened and his eyes closed again. Silas stood slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man was dying. Maybe he had hours left, maybe less. And there was nothing a boy, with empty pockets and dirty hands, could do about it. Except the thought came quietly, almost without permission. Abner kept milk in the cold cellar behind the stable. Fresh milk delivered that morning from the Patterson farm. Milk meant for the horses' mash, but milk all the same. Rich, nourishing, maybe. Enough to give a dying man one more day. Silas looked down at the warrior one more time, then turned and ran. Not back. To the settlement to report what he'd found. Not to fetch help or sound an alarm. He ran to steal milk for the enemy everyone told him had no soul. And somewhere in the distance, though he couldn't possibly have known it yet, 400 warriors had already begun their march. The cold cellar smelled of damp earth and horse feed. Silas pressed himself against the wooden doorframe, listening for Abner's heavy footsteps above. Nothing, just the creak of old timber, and the distant sound of horses shifting in their stalls. He had maybe 3 minutes before Abner would come looking for him, demanding to know why the water had taken so long. The milk jug sat on the stone shelf, beaded with condensation, fresh from the Patterson farm that morning, meant to be mixed into the horses' evening feed. Silas's hands trembled as he reached for it. Stealing from Abner wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. The last boy who'd taken food, without permission, had been thrown out with nothing but the clothes on his back. And Silas had nowhere else to go. But the image of those dark eyes filled with that terrible understanding of abandonment wouldn't leave his mind. He grabbed the jug and a small tin cup, tucked them under his shirt, and climbed back up the cellar stairs. The afternoon light hit his face as he stepped into the stable yard. His heart hammered so loud he was certain everyone within a mile could hear it. "Where in blazes have you been?" Abner's voice cut through the air like a whip. Silas spun around, the jug pressing cold against his ribs. "The creek, sir." Water was low. Had to walk. Upstream. Abner's eyes narrowed. He was a large man, weathered by years of hard work, with hands that could break a boy's arm as easily as snapping kindling. "Took you long enough. Get those stalls mucked before sundown, or you'll sleep outside with the dogs." "Yes, sir." Abner turned and walked back toward the house, and Silas exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. He waited until the man disappeared inside, then ran. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows longer. Silas found the spot easily. He'd memorized every tree, every stone. The warrior lay exactly as he'd left him, chest rising and falling in shallow movements. Still alive, barely. Silas knelt beside him and poured milk into the tin cup, lifting it to the man's lips. The warrior's eyes opened, slowly, focusing on the boy's face with an intensity that made Silas feel exposed, like every thought in his head was being read and understood. The man drank slowly this time, and when he finished, he spoke again in that flowing, incomprehensible language, but this time he lifted his hand and pressed it against his own chest. Then he pointed at Silas and pressed his hand over the boy's heart. "I don't know what you're saying," Silas whispered. The warrior tried again, his voice urgent despite its weakness. He pointed toward the west, toward the mountains barely visible through the trees. Then he made a gesture, fingers spreading wide, moving in a wave. "Many, many people." He pressed his chest again, then reached up and touched Silas's face with surprising gentleness. "Are you trying to tell me something about your people?" Silas asked. The man's eyes filled with something that looked like desperation. He gripped Silas's wrist and pulled him closer, speaking rapidly now, words tumbling over each other in a language that sounded like running water and distant thunder. Then his strength gave out, and he collapsed back against the ground, his breathing ragged. Silas stayed with him until the light began to fade, then carefully hid the jug and cup beneath a fallen log. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, though he knew the man couldn't understand. "I promise." As he ran back toward the settlement, the forest behind him seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And in the stable that night, Abner Cole stood in the cellar doorway, staring at the milk jug that was now 3 in lower than it had been that morning. His jaw tightened. Someone was stealing from him. And when he found out who, there would be consequences. The boy thought he'd been careful, but in a settlement this small, secrets never stayed buried for long. 3 more times, Silas made the journey. 3 more times, he stole milk from Abner's cellar. His hands steadier each time, his lies more practiced. The warrior grew weaker with each visit, but his eyes never lost that fierce intelligence, that desperate need to communicate something important. On the 4th day, Reverend Hayes rode through the settlement, ringing the warning bell. Silas was mucking stalls when he heard it. That harsh clanging sound that meant danger. He dropped the shovel and ran to the main road where people were already gathering. Apache, signs on the northern ridge, the Reverend announced, his face pale beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Tracks. Fresh ones, at least a dozen horses, maybe more. Everyone needs to stay close to town. No one goes into the forest alone. Silas felt his stomach drop. His secret suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous. If they found out he'd been going into the forest every day, if they discovered what he'd been doing, boy. Abner's voice cut through his thoughts. Get back to work, and if I catch you sneaking off anywhere, you'll answer for it. Silas nodded and returned to the stable, but his mind was racing. He couldn't go back to the forest now. Too risky. But the warrior was dying. Without food, without water, he might not last another day. That night, Silas waited until Abner's snoring rattled the walls, then slipped out through the back window. The moon hung thin and pale, casting barely enough light to see. He ran through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks until he reached the familiar spot. The warrior lay still, too. For a terrible moment, Silas thought he was already gone. Then the man's eyes opened and Silas saw the truth in them. This was the last time. There would be no tomorrow. Silas knelt beside him and offered water. The warrior drank only a little, then pushed the cup away. He reached up and touched Silas's face, his fingers trembling. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but there was urgency in every syllable. He pointed west again, made that spreading gesture. Many, many people. Then he touched his own chest and spoke a single word, repeating it 3 times. Nachi, 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 his name. He was telling Silas's name. Nachi, Silas repeated softly. The warrior Nachi smiled. Then his expression changed, becoming serious, almost pleading. He grabbed Silas's hand and pressed it against his own chest, over his heart. Then he took Silas's other hand and pressed it against the boy's chest. He spoke again longer this time, the words flowing like a prayer or a promise. Silas understood none of it, but tears burned in his eyes anyway. Nietzsche's grip loosened, his eyes closed, and between one breath and the next, he was gone. Silas sat there for a long time, holding the hand of a man whose language he didn't speak, whose people he'd been taught to fear. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He'd vetchet apazondi, a person who tried so hard to tell him something important, something about many people, something about hearts connected. Using his bare hands and a flat stone, Silas dug into the soft earth. It took hours. By the time he finished, his fingers bled and his shoulders ached. He lowered Nietzsche's body into the shallow grave as gently as he could, then covered him with soil and pine needles. He arranged stones in a circle around the spot, marking it so he could find it again. As dawn broke through the trees, Silas stood over the grave, exhausted and hollow. He'd done the only thing he could, given a dying man dignity in his final moments, kept him from dying completely alone. What he didn't know was that those carefully arranged stones formed a pattern, a message, one that would be read by eyes far sharper than his own. 7 days. That's all it would take for the message to reach them. 7 days for 400 warriors to learn that someone had honored their fallen brother. 7 days until everything changed. 6 days passed like a slow death. Silas went through the motions, mucking stalls, hauling water, avoiding eye contact, but his mind stayed in that clearing with those carefully arranged stones and the weight of secret he couldn't share. At night, he dreamed of Nietzsche's eyes, urgent and desperate, trying to communicate something Silas still couldn't understand. On the seventh morning, Abner cornered him in the feed room. "You think I'm stupid, boy?" The man's voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. "3 weeks I've been tracking that milk jug. Every few days it goes down. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough for a thief who thinks he's clever." Silas's mouth went dry. "I don't know what." Abner's hand shot out and grabbed his shirt, lifting him onto his toes. "Don't lie to me. Where's it going? You selling it? Trading it for something?" "No, sir. I would never." "Then where?" Abner shook him once. "Or tell me right now, or I swear I'll drag you to the Reverend and have you whipped in front of everyone." Silas's mind raced. He couldn't tell the truth. Couldn't admit he'd been helping an Apache, but he couldn't think of a lie good enough either. The silence stretched between them thick with threat. Then someone screamed. The sound came from outside. High and terrified, Abner released Silas and ran toward the door. The boy followed, his heart hammering, and burst into the yard where people were already gathering, pointing toward the ridge. The northern ridge where the forest met sky. And standing along that ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun, were riders, dozens of them. No more than dozens. They lined the entire length of the ridge, still as statues, their spears pointing toward heaven. "Get inside," someone shouted. "Get the children inside." Chaos erupted. People ran in every direction, mothers grabbing children, men rusing for rifles. The Reverend Hayes trying to restore order by shouting prayers nobody could hear over the panic. Silas stood frozen in the stable yard, staring at those distant figures, and felt something cold settle in his chest. They'd come. The Apache had come, and somehow he knew it was because of him. "How many?" a man yelled. Someone with a spyglass raised it with trembling hands. I count at least 200, maybe more. They're everywhere." 200. The number rippled through the crowd like poison. The settlement had maybe 40 men who could shoot. 40 against 200. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre waiting to happen. But the warriors didn't attack. They just sat on their horses perfectly still, watching, waiting. "Why aren't they moving?" Someone whispered. Reverend Hayes stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Maybe they want to talk. Maybe they're not here for a new sound cut him off. Hoof beats, not from the ridge, but from the east road. More riders." Silas turned and saw them coming. Another line of warriors. These ones closer, moving in perfect formation. They stopped 100 yards from the settlement's edge and formed a wall of horse flesh and iron. "Behind us," another voice screamed. "Silas Spoon." The south ridge now held another group, and when he looked west toward the mountains, he saw even more. They'd surrounded the entire settlement. Not 200 warriors. More. So many more. "They boxed us in." Abner breathed. "We're trapped." The crowd pressed together, everyone moving toward the center of the settlement, as if the buildings could somehow protect them. Women wept. Men checked their weapons with shaking hands. Children clung to their parents' legs, too scared to even cry. And still, the warriors didn't attack. They just waited silent, patient, like they had all the time in the world. The Reverend raised his hands. "We need to stay calm. We need to." A single rider broke from the northern group. He rode down the ridge slowly, deliberately, carrying a spear decorated with feathers. When he reached the edge of the settlement, he stopped. His voice rang out clear and strong, speaking in accented but understandable English. "We seek the boy," he called, "the one with hair like burnt grass and hands that carry mercy. Bring him forward. We have traveled far to find him." Every head in the settlement turned, looking, searching, looking for Silas. Silas couldn't move. His legs had turned to stone, his lungs forgotten how to pull air. All around him, people stared. Some confused, some beginning to understand, hair like burnt grass. That described only one person in the settlement. "You," Abner breathed, his voice filled with dawning horror. "You've been going into the forest, the milk, the Apache." His face twisted with rage and fear. What did you do?" Before Silas could answer, Reverend Hayes grabbed his arm. "Boy, if you know something about this, you need to speak now. All our lives depend on it." Silas's mouth opened, but no words came out. How could he explain? How could he make them understand that he'd only tried to help a dying man? That he hadn't known who Nitch was, hadn't known what would come after. "He's brought them down on us," a woman screamed. "The boys brought death to our door." "Give him to them," someone else shouted. "It's him they want. Let them have him, and maybe they'll leave the rest of us alone." The crowd surged forward, anger replacing fear. Hands reached for Silas, grabbing at his clothes, his arms. The Reverend tried to hold him back, but there were too many, too desperate. "Stop!" The voice cracked across the settlement like thunder. Everyone froze. The Apache rider who'd spoken before had dismounted and now stood at the edge of town, his spear planted in the ground. Behind him, the wall of warriors remained motionless, but the threat in their stillness was unmistakable. "The boy comes forward by choice," the rider said. "Not dragged, not forced. He walks on his own feet, or we take him and everyone else." Silence fell like snow. Slowly, the hands released Silas. The crowd stepped back, creating a path between the boy and the waiting warriors. A path that looked like a walk to an altar of sacrifice. Silas stood alone in that empty space, trembling so hard his teeth chattered. He was going to die. They would hurt him, probably make him pay for touching their warrior, for daring to be near one of their people. But then, he thought of Nicha's eyes, the way they'd softened when Silas had given him water, the way his hand had pressed over Silas's heart, trying to communicate something important even in his final moments. If he ran, they'd kill everyone. If he went willingly, maybe, just maybe, the others would be spared. Silas took one step forward, then another. His legs shook, but they carried him. Past Abner's accusing stare, past the Reverend's helpless expression, past all the people who'd never wanted him, never valued him, but who he was walking toward death to protect. When he reached the Apache rider, the man studied him with dark, unreadable eyes. "You are the one." "I don't know what I did wrong," Silas whispered, "but please don't hurt them. They didn't know. It was just me." The rider's expression didn't change. He turned and spoke in his own language, words that rippled across the waiting warriors like wind through grass. Then he gestured for Silas to follow. They walked together away from the settlement toward the northern ridge. With every step, Silas expected an arrow in his back, a blade across his throat, but nothing came. Just the sound of hoof beatots behind them as 24 warriors fell in as escort. At the ridge's crest, Silas finally saw what the settlement couldn't. The full scope of what had come for him. Warriors covered the landscape like a dark sea. Hundreds, easily 400, maybe more. They stretched in every direction, a force that could wipe the settlement off the map without breaking a sweat. And in the center of that sea, mounted on a painted horse, sat a man who radiated authority like heat from fire. He wore the full headdress of a chief, feathers cascading down his back. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp as broken glass. When those eyes found Silas, the boy felt pinned in place like a butterfly on a board. The rider beside Silas spoke. "This is Cochetta, war chief of the Indy, father of Nitch, who you found in the forest." The name hits Silas like a physical blow. Father Nitch had been the chief's son, and Silas had watched him die. Cochetta dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his age. He stood before Silas, towering over the boy, and for a long moment said nothing, just studied him with those sharp, penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone into whatever lay beneath. When he finally spoke, his English carried the weight of mountains. "My son went into the forest to hunt. He was strong, skilled, proud." Coach's jaw tightened, but the mountain lion was stronger. It caught him far from our camp, far from help. He knew he would die there, alone, like an animal with no name. Silas's throat constricted. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck. "For 3 days, we searched for him," Cochetta continued. "We found where the lion Attacked, found blood, found tracks leading deeper into the forest, but we could not find my son. His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes betrayed the grief beneath. Then our best tracker discovered stones, arranged in a pattern, a burial marker. Not our tradition, but a marker nonetheless. The rider who'd brought Silas forward spoke. The stones formed a circle. In the center, smooth river. Rocks were placed pointing west toward our territory. In our tradition, this pattern means respect for a fallen warrior. It means someone wished for his spirit to find its way home. Silas felt his chest tighten. He'd arranged those stones without thinking, just trying to mark the spot so he could find it again. He hadn't known they meant anything. Hadn't known the pattern carried meaning. Cochetta stepped closer. We opened the grave, found my son laid with respect, his weapons placed at his sides, his face clean of blood. Someone had closed his eyes. Someone had given him dignity in death. The chief's hand moved to his chest. This is not something your people do for hours. Not something we have ever seen from those who take our land. Silas found his voice small and cracking. He was suffering. I couldn't leave him there. You gave him water. Cochita said it wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Milk. Rich milk that your people keep for themselves. I stole it from a man I work for. I'm sorry. You stole. Coach's expression shifted, something that might have been respect flickering across his weathered features. You risked punishment to feed a dying enemy. Why? Silas thought about Nietzsche's eyes, about that moment of recognition when two souls who'd been abandoned by the world found each other in the worst possible circumstances. He looked at me the way I feel inside, alone like nobody cared if he lived or died. I know what that's like. Silence fell over the ridge. 400 warriors sat on their horses motionless. And Silas realized with a start that every single one of them was listening, waiting to hear what their chief would say next. In our tradition, Kocha said slowly, when someone saves the life or honors the death of one of our people, a debt is created, a sacred obligation that must be repaid. You cannot save my son's life. That was already beyond any man's power. But you saved something more precious. You saved his honor. You made sure he did not leave this world as forgotten meat for scavengers. The chief placed his hand on Silas's shoulder. The weight of it felt like a mountain settling onto the boy's bones. The stones you placed without knowing our way spoke a language older than words. You marked his grave with respect. You pointed his resting place toward his home. Whether you knew it or not, you honored him as one of our own would have done. Silas's eyes burned. He hadn't known, hadn't understood that those simple stones would mean so much. You were 11 years old. Cochetta said. Nate was 23, a warrior, a leader, my only son. His voice didn't break, but something in it fractured just the same. And now I must repay the debt your compassion created. Coachetta's hand remained on Silas's shoulder, steady as stone. Around them, the 400 warriors waited in absolute silence. Even the horses seemed to understand the weight of this moment, standing still as carved wood. Among my people, Cochetta said, there's a law older than memory. When a life debt is owed, it must be paid in equal measure. You honored my son in his death. You showed mercy when you had every reason to show fear. You gave food from your own mouth when you yourself were hungry. The chief's eyes held Silas's, unblinking. This debt cannot be paid with horses or weapons or land. It can only be paid with what you gave. Heart for heart, honor for honor. Silas didn't understand, couldn't understand. His mind felt slow, clouded by fear and exhaustion, and the impossible reality of standing before hundreds of warriors who could end his life with a single word from their chief. I offer you a choice, Cochetta continued. The first choice, you become my son, not in words alone, but in truth. You will live among us, learn our ways, be trained as Nitch would have been trained. Everything he would have inherited, respect, position, knowledge will be yours. You will never hunger again, never be unwanted again. You will be Day, Apache, one of us. The words hit Silas like physical blows. Adopted by an Apache chief. Given everything a child could want. Family. Belonging. Purpose. He'd spent 11 years being nobody. Worth nothing. And now, this man was offering him a life beyond anything he'd ever imagined. But leaving meant never seeing the settlement again, never knowing if the people he'd grown up around, even those who treated him poorly, were safe. It meant becoming something entirely different, something his Aunt Had-I and Reverend Hayes and everyone else would call savage. Enemy lost. The second choice, Cochetta said, and his voice softened slightly. You name anything within my power to give, and it is yours. Horses, gold, safe. Passage for your people, protection from raids. Whatever you desire, if I can. Granted, I will. Anything. The word echoed in Silas's head. He could ask for money enough to leave the settlement and start somewhere new. Could ask for horses and ride away from Abner Cole and his heavy hands. Could ask for revenge against those who'd hurt him. Could ask for comfort, security, escape. But as he stood there, wind pulling at his ragged shirt, he thought about the terror on the faces of the settlement. People, about how quickly they'd been willing to throw him to the wolves to save themselves, about the years of being invisible, unwanted, tolerated, but never loved. And he thought about Nitch, about how in his final moments, the warrior had tried so desperately to communicate something important. Not a warning, not a threat, a message about connection, about hearts touching across the divide of language and culture and fear. I don't know what to choose, Silas whispered. Cochetta nodded slowly. This is wise. Big choices should not be made. Quickly, he glanced at the rider beside him, then back at Silas. But know this, if you choose to become my son, you choose all that comes with it. Our enemies become your enemies. Our struggles become yours. The life is hard, boy. Harder than mucking stalls and stealing milk. And if I choose something else, then you return to your people with whatever you have asked for. And the debt is paid. We will not meet again. My warriors will leave this place and never return. Silas looked down at the settlement below. From this height, it looked so small, fragile. The buildings that had seemed permanent now appeared temporary, like children's toys arranged in the dirt. He could see people gathered in the central square, watching, waiting to learn if they would live or die based on what a boy they'd never valued would say next. The weight of 400 lives pressed down on him. His own people who'd shown him nothing but hardship, and Coach's people who'd traveled days to honor a debt to a child they didn't know. Can I ask you something first? Silas said quietly. Kosada inclined his head. Silas took a breath that felt like it might be his last free one. The question forming in. His mind was dangerous, possibly foolish, but it was the only one that mattered. When Nachi was dying, he said, slowly. He kept pointing at his heart, then at mine, like he was trying to tell me something about connection, about understanding. Silas met Coachetta's eyes. Do you think that's what he meant? That even though we're different, we're the same underneath? Coachetta was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something that might have been surprise. My son was wise beyond his years. Yes, I believe that is exactly what he meant. Then I know what I want to ask for. The chief waited. Teach them. Silas gestured toward the settlement below. Teach my people that not all Apache are enemies. Show them what I learned, that you have honor, that you value life, that you're not the monsters they think you are. His voice grew stronger. And let me teach your people the same thing. That not every settler wants to take from you, that some of us just want to live without fear. The silence that followed was so complete that Silas could hear his own heartbeat. For 100 warriors sat motionless. Coachetta's expression was unreadable, carved from stone and shadow. Then slowly the chief began to nod. You are a strange child, Coachetta said, and something that might have been a smile touched his weathered face. You could have asked for wealth, for power, for escape from hardship. Instead, you asked for something that benefits everyone but yourself. You placed both hands on Silas's shoulders. My son chose well when he marked you as worthy of honor. Coachetta turned to face his warriors and spoke in their language. his voice carrying across the ridge like wind through canyons. Silas didn't understand the words, but he understood the response. 400 spears lifted toward the sky in perfect unison, then struck the ground once with a sound like thunder. Agreement, acceptance. The chief reached up and removed the bone necklace from around his own throat. It was simple, but beautiful, carved with symbols Silas didn't recognize. This belonged to Niche. He wore it from the day he became a warrior. Now it belongs to you. While you wear it, you walk under the protection of the Unday. No Apache will raise a hand against you or those you claim as your own. He placed it around Silas's neck. The weight of it felt sacred. 3 horses, Cochetta continued. Strong ones. They are yours to keep or trade. And this promise while you live, while that necklace remains around your neck. No warrior of mine will raid your settlement. Your people will be safe. Tears streamed down Silas's face. He couldn't stop them and didn't try. Go back to your people, Coaches said gently. Tell them what happened here. Tell them that an 11-year-old boy taught both our people something we'd forgotten. That mercy is stronger than hate. That kindness can change the course of war. Silas walked down the ridge on trembling legs. 3 magnificent horses following behind him, the necklace heavy and warm against his chest. When he reached the settlement, people stared in stunned silence. At the boy they dismissed, at the horses, at the Apache who were already beginning to depart, heading back toward the mountains in organized columns. Abner Cole stepped forward, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. Boy, my name is Silas, he said quietly, and I don't work for you anymore. He walked past them all, past the Reverend, past his aunt, past everyone who'd ever looked through him like he wasn't there. He walked to the edge of town and stopped, watching the Apache disappear into the distance. For the first time in his life, Silas Brennan understood what it meant to belong to something larger than himself. Not because someone had taken him in out of pity, but because he'd earned it with compassion when compassion was the hardest thing in the world to give. The settlement would never forget the day 400 warriors came for a poor boy who'd shown mercy to a dying enemy. And neither would Silas forget the moment he learned that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can echo across generations, changing hearts that everyone had believed were beyond changing. The debt had been paid, but the bond it created would last far, longer than any of them could know. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage meets destiny in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.